Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's International Inequalities Institute seminar series talk. We have Joaquin Prieto, our own Joaquin Prieto from the International Inequalities Institute. Joaquin has finished his PhD in the Department of Social Policy in 2020 and has been working as a research officer at the International Inequalities Institute. He has trainings in hardcore sciences, engineering, as well as economics and social sciences. So Joaquin today will talk about multidimensional quality of employment and dynamics, which is the longitudinal view, and he will talk about evidence from Chile. And this is a joint work with Kristen Zamberg, also our own Kristen Zamberg, and Diego Vidal from the Faculty of Economics and Business and University of Chile. So Joaquin, floor is yours. Before that, let me remind you what the how the seminar is going to go. We have 40 to 45 minutes talk by Joaquin. Joaquin kindly allowed for quick clarification questions to be asked during the presentation. Otherwise, if you have substantive questions, you need to wait for the end of the presentation. We will have 15 to 20 minutes to answer the questions. So thank you so much, Joaquin. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Before starting with the presentation, I would like to mention that this research is part of the Quality of Employment in Middle-Income Countries project, which is financed by the British Academy Global Professorship Program. The work that I will present this morning is called Multidimensional Quality of Employment Dynamics, and I had done it together with Kristen Zamberg and Diego Vidal. In a nutshell, we measure the quality of employment index from a multidimensional and longitudinal perspective, using panel data from the Social Protection Survey in Chile. First, we build the Quality of Employment Index for each wave, following Zamberg and her colleague strategy. Second, we propose a method to analyze the dynamics between the different dimensions in the quality of employment in the working population. And finally, we carry out a longitudinal analysis of the quality of employment dynamics of the population in the labor market. Our results show 5 findings. First, during the Great Recession period 2006-2009, 1 out of good jobs deteriorated their quality of employment. Second, when economic growth resumed between 2012 and 2019, 1 out of 3 bad jobs improves in terms of the dimension that compose their quality. Third, income labor dimension mainly explain the transition from good job to bad job and vice versa. Fourth, there is a gender gap where women show higher rates of bad jobs compared to men, and non-worker men have a higher chance of getting a good job, while non-working women have a high chance of getting a bad job. The presentation is structured as follows. First, I present the motivation and background, then I describe the methodology we use, and finally, I present the results and conclusions. In recent years, the quality of employment has attracted increasing attention from policymakers. The combined effects of globalization and labor market deregulation have meant that a large proportion of workers were being hired through increasingly flexible contracts in both developed and developing countries. A large proportion of workers were being hired on a short-term freelance subcontract or even 0 hours basis. Meanwhile, in developing countries, former employment has become more precarious even as a skill level improved, while the widespread informal employment has not always diminished. In this context, debates about job quality have multiplied, leading to policy questions about re-regulating the labor market to tackle problems associated with employment regulation and social protection system. Others have argued economic effects of the COVID crisis could lead to increased and more rapid job losses, especially if the crisis accelerates the use of technology and artificial intelligence in firms. In developing countries, there are 3 main lessons learned about employment. First, that economic growth alone does not necessarily improve employment conditions. And second lesson is that social insurance system cannot be built on precarious labor markets. And third, policymakers have understood that it's impossible to increase productivity levels when quality of employment levels are low. In our opinion, quality of employment measure should be generated primarily to guide policy. If we take this perspective, then an adequate, appropriate quality of employment measure, it must be understandable and easy to describe. It must reflect common sense notion of quality of employment. It must be able to target the deprived track changes and guide policy, of course, and it must be technically solid. It must be operationally viable in terms of data requirement, for example, and it must be easy to replicate. And we add that it must be feasible to be analyzed from a longitudinal perspective. Why is it relevant to analyze the dynamics and the quality of employment? Once there is agreement on how to build a multidimensional quality of employment index, it becomes natural for policymakers to monitor and understand how individual workers move between bad or good jobs over time and what drives those changes. There are two main benefits of analyzing the quality of employment dynamics. On the one hand, it allows to identify those workers that transition from bad good to good jobs, from those workers that appear to be stuck in poor quality jobs, and also it enables to identify the precise dimension of the quality of employment driving the transition between good and bad jobs. However, analyzing a quality of employment index from a longitudinal perspective has important difficulties. There are, in first place, the interdependencies between the dimension of the quality of employment index, which makes the identification of the driving dimension in the quality of employment a difficult problem to solve. I will refer to this point later. And to solve the identification problem, we need a methodological strategy and also longitudinal data, which is scarce in countries in the global south. This measure suggests a strong agreement at least one basic point. Jobs are more than just earning, or jobs quality is multidimensional. However, we know from the multidimensional poverty literature that there is an intense debate about how best to measure deprivation in multiple dimensions. While there is a consensus that poverty is a multidimensional and that joint distribution is the interesting part of the poverty analysis, there is also an active debate of how to best measure poverty and the exact role of the joint distribution. Will some prefer scar indices of multidimensional poverty? Other prefers a dashboard approach that considers only marginal distribution, and yet others suggest complementing the dashboard with a separate analysis of the joint distribution. Related with the quality of employment dynamic literature, we can say that in developed countries, the importance of panel data in the analysis of the wages on employment has long been recognized. Indeed, panel data is essential to do that. A prominent question in this line of research is how to distinguish and quantify persistent and transient dynamics in two dimensions of quality of employment. Wage dynamics, this is transition between low pay, higher pay, and underemployment, and employment dynamics. This is transition between non-standard employment, standard employment, and unemployment. However, a recent study analyzed the dynamic between bad and good jobs in Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, Paraguay, and Peru. This author identified two major types of labor movement in these 6 countries analysis. First, that workers who have good jobs normally transit to good jobs. And second, workers who have bad jobs normally transit to bad jobs or unemployment. This second type of labor movement is likely to entail a vicious circle of low wages and lack of income, especially given the limited access to social protection in the region. So in this context, my research attempts to understand what are the labor market dynamics during an economic crisis and recovering growth from a multidimensional quality of employment perspective? What dimension dynamics of quality of employment lead people into bad jobs, and what dimension change lead them out? To answer this question, we propose a multidimensional dynamics framework that identify each dimension dynamics of quality of employment simultaneously with the composed index transitions. So this research made 3 contributions to the literature on the dynamic labor market and measures of quality of employment. First, it shows how scholars and policymakers can accurately identify the most vulnerable group of workers and quantify their trends and net change over time. This would allow analysts to understand to what extent workers become trapped in poor quality jobs and which active labor market policies could help them. Second, we provide an approach that allows us to study the relationship between quality of employment and its dimension in a dynamic setting. It shows that we must look beyond individual problems, for example, labor informality or particular types of contract, to the general concept of quality of work to understand the accumulation process of deprivation in the working condition. And third, this approach is applied to Chile using panel data from the Social Protection Survey between 2004 and 2020. Chile is an interesting case study for 3 reasons. First, Chile has been cited as a successful case of development, entering the select club of countries with the highest income in the world, according to the World Bank in 2013, and 4 years later being classified as a developed country by the OECD Development Assistance Committee. However, this continued economic growth and improvement in human development indicator have not been enough to reduce the high levels of inequality. Second, Chile is an economy that has similarities to developed countries in terms of labor market institutions. For example, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, and active labor market program. But it still has a labor market in transition to economic development, with a significant proportion of informal work, extensive gender inequality in employment and earning, and one of the lowest rate of female participation among OECD members countries, and also in Latin America. And third, labor market dynamics in Global South countries have not widely studied, mainly due to the scarcity of panel data. However, the Chilean Social Protection Survey overcame this limitation because it was designed precisely to characterize the Chilean labor market and social protection from a longitudinal perspective. Thus, the EPS is unique in Latin America, both for being the survey with the largest number of weights and sample size in the region, and the considerable amount of information about working conditions it collects from his interviewees. The Social Protection Survey of Chile that is carried out by the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, and the table shows the 5 subsamples that we use in our analysis. I will explain later. After pulling together, we got almost 36,000 observations of individuals in working age in 2 waves. Now, I'm going to describe the methodological strategy to analyze the quality of employment from a longitudinal perspective. And first, it specifies how the multidimensional indicator of job quality and his partial indices are being constructed. Second, it proposed a method to analyze the dynamics of the quality of employment indicator and its partial indices, taking into account the interaction between the quality of employment dimensions. So we adopted a Kyle-Foster approach to generate a multidimensional index of quality of employment And we follow a similar strategy to the study on quality of employment in 2020 carried out by Kirsten Sindroth and her colleagues. Alkay and Foster proposed a multidimensional index with an adjusted headcount ratio that is sensitive to changes in the dimension in the phenomena that household or individuals are facing. The adjusted headcount ratio has two characteristics that make it an appropriate measure for policy analysis. The first is that it simultaneously measures both the incidence, the proportion of working in bad job, and the intensity of the quality of employment. That means the number of deprivation affecting it. The second is that it can be decomposed by dynamic subgroup of workers. For example, ongoing bad job in tries, bad job exit, and ongoing good jobs. The methodology first applies a vector of deprivation cutoff, denoted by C, to identify those workers who are deprived in a given dimension. It then defines a counting vector, CI, as the weighted sum of the labor deficiency experienced by the worker I, where I upper class is a variable that takes the value 1 if the worker achievement Y is less than C in dimension J and 0 if not. W is the weight assigned to each dimension, and D is the total number of deprivation analyzed. In a second step, it set a multidimensional threshold, denoted K, to classify individuals working in multidimensional bad job or good job. After identification, a simple form of aggregation is the calculation of the incidence of quality of employment. It is defined as A, where Q is the number of workers in multidimensionally deprived bad job, and N is the total of the population. The intensity or the percentage of deprivation of the average poor quality job is defined as A, where CK is the sensory counting vector, because the deprivation of good job for the individual I are replaced with 0 values. That is the main idea that people who are working with multidimensional poverty, maybe that's know about that. And now we have the quality of employment adjusted ratio. That is the main measure that we use in the next step. And it is calculated as the weighted sum of deprived dimension among those who hold poor quality jobs in relation to the total number of possible deprived dimension for all workers. More intuitively, M0 can also be expressed as the product of the partial index incidence and intensity. The M0 can be decomposed into dimensional partial indexes, HK, called sensory headcount ratio, that depict the percentage of the population who are deprived in multidimensional bad job and are deprived at the same time in employment dimension J. So now I will try to explain the change in the quality of employment index and its the composition. The basic component of the quality of employment chain is the difference in quality of employment levels across periods. For any two periods, the initial period is denoted by T minus S and the final period T, where S is the number of years. The absolute rate of change can be computed simple as the difference in M0 between two periods, keeping the set of relevant parameters fixed in time, C, W, and K. One important property that the Alkay-Foster family of measures satisfy, it is decomposability. Thus, the quality of employment change over time can be calculated and decomposed into different aggregate measures following the recent literature of multidimensional poverty dynamics. First, absolute change of M0 can be decomposed into change in dimension-specific sensory headcount ratio. Second, absolute change of M0 can also be decomposed into population-specific change for L subgroup. And third, both dimensional breakdowns and subgroup decomposable can be applied to unfold absolute rate of change even further. Following the latter double decomposition, our approach to studying the dynamics of quality of employment deprivation first divides the population into dynamic subgroup of workers, for example, ongoing bad job entry, bad job exit, and ongoing good job, and then analyze dimensional decomposition of each the dynamic subgroups. A fixed sample of N workers is used in two periods, T and T minus S, known as balanced panel, to analyze the quality of employment transition in detail. Workers are characterized in two mutually exclusive and exhaustive groups. First, workers with good job, J in period T and T minus S. Second, workers with bad job in both periods, the ongoings. Third, workers with bad job in period T minus S who exceed low quality of employment in period T. And fourth, workers with good jobs in period T minus S who enter bad jobs in period T. And we have pointed out above, the change in the adjusted headcount ratio of quality employment can be decomposed by population subgroups. The first component of equation is due to the change in the intensity of those who remain in the low quality in both periods, the ongoing bad jobs, weighted by the size of the dynamic subgroup. The second component reveals the change in the intensity of those who enter bad job, also weighted by the size of the dynamic subgroup. And the third component reflects the population weighted change in the intensity of those who exit bad jobs. As discussed, the challenge to identify changes in dimensional partial index of quality of employment is that they can result from workers in bad job exiting deprivation, J, for example, or from workers leaving bad job due to improvement in other dimension, in other quality of employment dimension. The figures show all transition represented by arrow pointed to change from T minus S to time T for any dimension J, relevant for change for the sensory headcount ratio. A worker can have a bad job and be deprived in J, a good job but be deprived in J, a bad job and not be deprived in J, or a good job and not be deprived in J. Thus, if an individual in T minus S has a bad job and a deprived in dimension J, the sensory headcount ratio in T decrease as a result of three different transitions. First, if workers exit deprivation but remain in bad jobs. Second, if workers exit both deprivation and bad job. And third, if workers leave bad job but not the deprivations. Change in dimensional partial indices of quality of employment can also be decomposed into dynamic subgroups as follows. Each component is related to the pair of transition. The first component of equation is due to the transition in dimension J without change or bad job status. The second component reveals that those who enter bad job either changing to non-deprived or maintaining J deprived. And the third component shows those who exit bad job either changing deprived or maintaining J deprived. As I pointed out, the cutoff and weight for each dimension and indicator are the same ones Kirsten Simbrut and her colleagues have used in several of their works. I will not explain in detail all of them because the focus of this study is the analysis of the quality of employment indicator dynamics. From this slide, I only want to mention that we used 5 indicator groups grouped in 3 dimensions: labor income, employment stability, and employment conditions. The 3 figures show what is known as the dashboard of headcount ratio by indicator and year. In the first figure, 2009, appeared like the year with a higher proportion of deprived workers in income, which would be explained by the economic crisis in 2007, 2008, and in the year 2015 and 2019, it stabilized close to 20%. In the second figure, we see that both the occupation status indicator and the tenure indicator fluctuate between 2004 and 32% during the period studied. In the third figure, both the social security indicator and the excessive working hour show a decrease between 2004 and 2019. It should be noted that the proportion of workers with excessive hours fell from 35% in 2004 to 18% in 2018. It showed the effect of working hour per week law implemented in 2005, which reduced from 48 to 45 hours per week. First, I show cross-sectional results. This figure shows the evolution of the headcount ratio for the period 2004 and 2019. The x-axis shows the percentage of bad jobs, and the y-axis shows the survey application waves. We plot the proportion of bad jobs for men and women and for all workers. From this figure, we get 2 conclusions. First, although the level of bad jobs have been declining after the 2007-2008 economic country crisis in 2019, and we still have 35% of all workers in poor quality jobs. Second, the analysis shows a growing gap in the quality of employment between men and women, and the proportion of women in bad jobs is higher than men for the whole period analyzed.
Okay.
By 2009, yes?
Sorry, may I ask a question of clarification?
Of course.
So remind me again how many dimensions are here and what the cutoff is, the dimensional cutoff. I think you're calling it C.
Yes, I can. It's 3 dimension,
yeah,
5 indicator, and the cutoff is 1/3. Mm-hmm.
1/3. So all you need is to be poor in one of the dimensions, and then you are to be deprived in one of the dimensions, and then you are poor.
If you are in the case of labor income, yes. In the case of employment stability and employment condition, you can stay in one of them, and altogether you can.
Yeah, but if you are in both, so basically, as long as you have a 1/3 weight, you are poor.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You are in bad job.
Sorry, yes, in bad job.
Yes, the main point is the second point is that the proportion of women in bad job is higher than men for the whole period analyzed, and by 2009, 45% of women jobs and 45% of men jobs were bad jobs, lowering to 40% for women and 30% for men before the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019. So this figure shows the change in the quality of employment indices uses for those who worked between 2 consecutive waves. So it's a dynamic way to see the bad jobs. Yes, the x-axis shows the change. In green, then tries to bad jobs, and in orange, the exit from bad jobs. Here, 2 results stand out. First, in all years analyzed, there are workers that enter bad job and others that exit bad job. Second, for both men and women, the period of economic crisis was the period where the proportion of workers that enter bad job was greater than those that exit bad jobs. And this is the reason why the black line that corresponds to the sum of both transition appear positive only for that period. And from the perspective of the labor market dynamics, the question arises, where do those who enter or exit bad jobs come from? By gender, to try to answer this question. Table A shows the average way to weigh labor market transitions. The red diamond shows that for both men and women that were in good job in a specific period, 7 out of 10 workers remain in good job in the next period, T. And for both men and women who have good jobs, the probability of remaining in good jobs the following period is high. Figure B shows that for women, the probability of moving to a bad job to good job, this is the black line, is very similar to the probability of leaving the labor market. Whereas men not only have a higher chance of moving to good job, but also is much higher than the transition to unemployment or inactivity. This figure A and figure B show now the non-worker transition probability by genders. Again, stand out the difference between men and women for both the transition from unemployment and the transition from not in the labor market in figure B. In both figures, it is the continuous black line, the one that shows the probability of transition from to state or non-working to good jobs, while non-working men have the higher chance of getting a good job, non-worker women have a higher chance of getting a bad job. Although it's not be the focus on the study, we ran a multidimensional logic model, find out with driver and behind the chances, the quality of employment for both women and men. Here we show the marginal effects for variables such as health, disability status, union economic activity. The model control for age, education, household income, marital status, children, region, and wage year. I want to share 3 results that capture our attention. They are marked with a red diamond. First, a male working a bad job with a good health has a 90% for more likely to have a good job in the next period. Second, a male who worked in a bad job in a union member has 20% more likely to move for a good job. And a female contraction working with a bad job has 12% more likely to have a good job in the next period. Contraction is the only economic activity show a positive probability of exit a bad job. Here we find 3 results that open door to new research that relate the quality of employment with institutional aspect, the labor market, and worker health in emerging countries. And now we're going to see the evolution of the adjusted headcount ratio. Let us remember that is the quality of employment measure allow us to focus only on the deprivation of those who are in bad job. It allows us to identify those workers who have changed their deprivation but keep in bad jobs. The first figure shows the evolution of M0 for men and women from a cross-sectional view. And the second figure shows the adjusted headcount ratio change by round pairs also for men and women. Let's pay attention to the period 2009 and 2012. In the case of men, I marked it with a red diamond. In orange, you can see the exit from bad job explain a negative change of 0.10 in M0 values. And the color blue shows those who remain in bad job, but improve in some of their deprivation. As we have said, the adjusted quality of employment index can be broken down by groups and by its dimension. We estimate the M0 for workers who exit non-worker status using this property. We found those female working in T time with exit employment in T minus S time had 0.37 M0 values, much more than the average of all the workers with bad jobs, 0.277. The adjusted quality of employment index is even higher, 0.4, for females who are not in the labor force in T minus S, and the contribution for labor income indicator in dark blue explain more than 40% of the M0 for both group of females, sorry.
Joaquin,
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry. May I ask another question of clarification?
Of course.
So otherwise I won't be able to follow. If you go back one slide, feel free to defer this if this is, so here, the M0, right? This is the product of the head count and the intensity measure A, which is an intensity measure across dimensions. So if I change in some dimension, my deprivation status changes in one dimension, that can affect this M0 in two ways. It can affect it through the intensive margin, A, and it can affect through the extensive margin by shifting me in or out of poverty because I crossed that threshold C, right? So it seemed to me intuitively that this decomposition by change of M0 by changes in HJ should be a little complicated. You had, though, a result by Apalaza and Yalonetsky earlier, where you just said, oh, this is decomposable by changes in H, and there are some weights. Are those weights complicated in the sense that they incorporate the fact that changes in HJ for individual I can affect this thing to these two different channels? So for example, you and I may become more deprived in one dimension, I don't know, whichever job dimension here, but I also become poor. So for me, that HJ changes things in a different way than it does for you, right? You see what I'm saying? So that decomposition has to have some complicated thing to it that I'm missing here.
Yeah, that's why we show a different composition. This is the first, and the last is the composition only by dimensions, the headcount rate to sensory, because this is very interesting because it's people who are deprived and how change in only this dimension. I can show you because this way to show that try to fix the problem that you can see very well and explain well. Indeed, for example, the problem with you can see the problem in this in this case when you can, for example, you can move from one dimension to another dimension, but you cannot move to other. And this is the change for the HK. That is the last table that I would like to share with you.
Thank you.
But yes, you're right. That's, I think, it's one of the contributions that we are doing here. There's the last two slides. We did the same exercise for workers who enter not working status, and we find similar trends. Those female working T-S who enter unemployment in time T have 0.34 MO values, and the adjusted quality of employment index is even higher for female who are not in the labor force in time. We can say that is a large proportion of women move from unemployment and inactivity to bad job and vice versa, revealing a trap of bad jobs explained fundamentally by low income that deserve to be studied in deep in future research. Finally, I will show the changes in adjusted headcount ratio by gender. Let us recall that adjusted headcount ratio is a percentage, a proportion of the population who are working in bad jobs and are deprived in the unemployment dimension J at the same time. This figure allows us to know what adjusted headcount ratio is the one that contributes most for the two specific periods, the economic crisis and the two ways that capture the period of great economic expansion in Chile. And for both men and women, the labor income is the dimension that contributes most to increasing the try to bad jobs during the economic crisis, and increasingly the exit during the period of economic expansion between 2013 and 2016. To close the presentation, and we have time to have some questions, we provide empirical evidence for quality of employment across sectional perspective for Chile. By 2019, 50% of jobs in Chile were a bad job, lowering to 35% before the COVID pandemic. A gender gap in quality of employment persisted during the whole period analyzed. Measuring the multidimensional quality of employment index from a longitudinal perspective enable answer the following question: what dimension of the index contributes more to the quality of employment dynamics? Out of the three dimensions of the quality of employment index, the labor income dimension proved to be the more relevant to explain transition between good and bad jobs during both the economic crisis and the period of economic expansion. And are workers persistent in good jobs? Workers, both women and men who are in a good job have greater chance of continuing a good job in the next period. And are there gender difference in the quality of employment transition pattern? Transitioning from a bad job to good job is more likely in men for women, while non-working men have a higher chance to get in a good job, non-working women have a higher chance of getting a bad jobs. That's it. Thank you for keep here.
Thank you so much, Joaquin, for a great presentation. It's very thought-provoking. So I would now collect the questions from the audience. Please post your questions by raising the hand function, then I'll try to give you the, and then unmute yourself and ask the questions. Or you can also write your questions under the reaction section, and then I'll try to read them out. Paulo, would you like to go and unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, thanks. So thank you, Joaquin, for the presentation. I have two rather general points. One is on the partial or possibly large substitutability of the dimensions. So like the aggregation for this type of measure has always this problem of to what extent we consider the lack of one dimension to be compensated by others dimensions. So I wonder whether you have some robustness or you want to include some robustness while you introduce and you vary the degree of substitutability of the dimensions into the aggregation of the inequality. And the second question is concerns the, let's say, external validity of the estimates. That is, to what extent you suspect missing information, or to be more precise, a lack of coverage of certain types of jobs that maybe also some types of individuals involved in maybe the informal sector and the type of job that are, by definition, bad jobs. Thanks.
Well, we try to do the same analysis with another concept, precarious employment. That is very interesting because it's more simple than the quality of employment. So you only have less indicator, and in this case, one of the results, but it's another paper, show that not always labor informality is related with low income and these kind of things. It's very interesting. I'm not sure that it's the case of Chile or an emerging country, but in the last report of the PNUD shows similar result that people in employment, labor employment, in labor informality, does not mean they have low income in some Latin American country. I think it's one of the things that right now some scholars they are thinking about that.
I want to give the voice to Chico. Could you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay, so thanks, thanks, Joaquin. This is really interesting. I have 3 questions. 2 are straightforward. One is a little bit less straightforward for me to ask. So I wonder if you could please go back to the slide where you had the decomposability results. I remember you cited Apalaza and Yalonetsky in a decomposition by dimensional change. There we go. So this one, right, this equation here, delta M0, the first one below 0.2, to me is sort of counterintuitive in the sense that I would have expected there to be 2 terms. And you have to tell me the intuition, at least, for why I'm wrong, which is the two terms I was expecting was that, again, this delta H for each individual can have an impact, as I was saying before, I'm repeating my earlier question, can have an impact on intensity, right, on A, or it can have an impact on the cutoff, and therefore on H, on this sort of extensive margin, whether I'm qualified as bad job or good job. So I thought there should have been two terms here, unless somehow inside this WJ, inside this weight, is some way of computing for that. Now I could go and read the Gaston's paper, his co-author, but you could save me that reading if you can explain to me. Then I'll ask my other 2 questions afterwards. Maybe I sort of misunderstood something here.
Well, I got your point. I have to say that this is the way that I found to simplify the presentation. But because there is a long equation to try to use the composition property, but I have to say that I think that it's very useful, the idea to see the chains in each dimension. So my point for you is you got the chains in H, the sensory headcount ratios, because this chains is how one dimension chain, even though only for the case that they are deprivable. So in this case, you are right that it's an intensive. They are it's measured the intensity in some way, but I suppose that the weight is a way to relate it with the case. So maybe the sub index J and J maybe they did not be the same. I had to check that, but now I got the point. Yeah. Okay.
So that was one. Thank you, and I'll also have a look at that paper to see whether I got that right or not. But two very quick questions. Sorry. The other one, I mean, a sort of very obvious standard one, which I'm sure you must get all the time when you present this, is they have M1 as well, right? Which, in addition to intensity in the breadth of dimensions, considers intensity in the depth of dimensions, right? Like a poverty gap. So they have a multidimensional poverty gap, M1. By choosing M0, by using only M0, you're focusing you're choosing deliberately to ignore intensity in the loss within each dimension. And my question is why? And then the second one, and then I'll stop, is to elaborate a little bit on Paulo's question. Let me ask you the following. Suppose you have a very, very poor person in a Santiago slum, very, very poor, okay? Is her trade-off between income and I don't know, give me another dimension, I don't know, having a pension or access to Social Security, right? Is her trade-off between these two the same as for a person who earns 5 times as much as she does? So who has, you know, quite a bit of higher income, still deprived, maybe still deprived on the income dimension, but much less than the first one. You know, is her trade-off the amount of pesos she will pay in her utility function for getting access to Social Security? Are those the same? Because you know, to use this framework, you are basically telling us that you think they are the same.
Yes, good point. I think that one of the things that we can go in deep is the mechanism that they are working between both, because I think this is a good example, the idea in the importance of class one deprivation to other, because it's maybe, I can change your point. Maybe it's not the same to be deprived in 2 indicators that another 2. So even though for us it's the same, maybe they have some quality that I thought that is difficult to show. But I see the point that you and Paulo put, and maybe we need to say something about that.
Why choose M0 rather than M1, which obviously is more complicated, but captures the
intensity. Okay. So now this is the first. I have to say, in my opinion, I think that is very interesting, your point, but to see not with M1, but more interesting we see with the cumulative deprivation. And I saw a recently paper related with that tried to put only the individual or household they are in the bottom of the distribution, and put all together. And I think that this kind of thing is the best way to try to not to deal with the weights and this kind of things, and try to put to say something in the deep of the intensity, but we don't put M1 only to not complicate more the paper, but and in my head in this moment is try to solve this problem with another model. I'm not sure that M1 is the best, because.
Thank you.
Could I just make a comment? Could I just make a comment?
Please go ahead.
This is not going to resolve any of the technical issues, but this paper at the moment, it's going to work in occupations, which is nowhere near as technical as this conversation is going. So that's the journal that we're aiming for very, very specific reasons. But you're right in that, you know, these are technical issues we should look at, but I think they're not going to go into this paper just as a publication strategy, because there's never been anything like this study done in the world of job quality. And our job in this paper for now is to argue that we're not measuring dashboards anymore. So in a way, you're a step ahead of where we're going. And we're still fighting with lots of people who think that you know, employment should just be measured as a dashboard with, you know, 70 different indicators, and this is much too complex a topic to synthesize. And so at the moment, this paper is responding to that kind of a literature, not to the technical literature. But also Mauricio's on the call. I don't know whether he would like to add any. Mauricio is the Apablasa in the Apablasa in Jablonecki. I don't know whether he'd like to add anything on the technical side, because we're certainly looking at these issues with the other papers that we're producing. but we're still fighting with the basics in terms of, you know, the resistance that we get from the discipline, because we're at the same point where Sabine Al-Kaya and multidimensional poverty were, like, you know, 20 years ago, when nobody wanted to think about poverty from a multidimensional perspective. And we're in the quality of employment literature, which actually hasn't done any of this work before yet. So I'm still, you know, convincing people that a measure such as this one could potentially be useful. And these are people who will not be able to follow this technical discussion. I don't know whether that comment helps, but just to give you a bit of context.
Well, you know, Carsten, you and I and Joaquin could have a very long conversation about this. I mean, I don't think some of these things are actually that technical, and I think they might help convince people, you know, because I think some of the people might have problems like the ones that Paulo and I think Berkay are having, which is like, okay, I mean, if the marginal rate of substitution is constant everywhere, I don't believe this. You know, and so, you know, now I'm not saying you should go and talk to the policymakers about the marginal rate of substitution, but you have to have it in the paper incorporated in some way, and then you can deal with how you explain it to the you know, Emma will help us with that. But I rather than speak more, I'd love to hear from Mauricio if he can shed light on my original big question about the delta H, you know, there being two terms in the decomposition of his or not.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share a bit of this. This is an old paper from 2013 that we wrote with Gaston using data from child poverty, if I don't make a mistake. In a specific case, we were trying to mix transitions and changes in probability based on dominance, kind of dominance strategy. So you were measuring for those who are above certain cutoff K, and then you go a bit further and you include those who are by union approach, moving to intersection approach. So we were trying to measure these small changes inside of this, in this big picture with individuals in different kind of condition. In that case, we were analyzing poverty, as I mentioned, child poverty, and the main concern was, can we decompose this using an idea of not only probabilities, but also a kind of decomposition analysis using a dominance or a kind of dominance analysis. But I would be happy to talk a bit further whenever you want to see how can we apply this in the same way that we applied in that paper of 2013.
Well, thank you so much, Mauricio. So thank you so much, Chico, for voicing also my concern as well as Paulo. So I wrote down 3 questions that I would ask, and then all of them are asked already by the previous people. And I want to say that, like, I also think that these are, like, clarifying these things would be helping to advance your arguments in the literature. So I'm on that camp. I should also ask a few clarification questions if there's no other question from the audience, and I want to use my privileges of the chair. One of the clarification questions is very basic. You use an employment survey, and you know, like, as you go down the bad jobs ranking, you're more likely to find people who are doing multiple jobs rather than single job, your first job, second job, main job. And how do people define in the survey what is the main job, what is the secondary job, and does that affect how do you deal with them in your index empirically? That's one question. And the second thing is, like, the dynamics between bad jobs and unemployment and recession periods was very interesting, because your main discussion on the broader scheme that is about the trends and dynamics. I can imagine in a scenario where the recession or unemployment rate goes up, number of bad jobs disappear. So the size of the bad jobs as a share in the population is very much dependent on the economic conditions, which then the relative share of good jobs goes up during the times of recessions, which is kind of counterintuitive to think about the index, what it wants to do. So I was wondering whether you want to say something about, I mean, that goes back to the idea of substitution versus the total shares, and whether you keep them constant. Because unlike the multidimensional poverty index, that we are not only talking about the units of analysis as being individuals, the units of analysis are being the jobs themselves. So just wanted to have a bit more reflections. And I think with that, we finish very soon.
Thank you, Berka. First, I have to say that the discussion about the substitution is, I think, is very important, and I think what is the contribution of this paper, because the quality of employment in all the international agencies, they are not thinking in a dynamic way, so they don't have to discuss about the substitution or this kind of thing. So that's why I made the point that if you put the challenge that to build a quality of employment index, you need to think in a dynamic way to try to solve or to fix the thing that appear, and sometimes they are high when you don't have this kind of situation. This is the first. So thank you for these comments. And I had to read again the Pawlasa Jarosensky paper. We are lucky that we have a Mauricio here and in the team. So related with your question, the EPS collect both the main job and the second job. The distinction between main and second job is related with the level of income. We are, for example, is the most important job is the who receive more income, and we are working only with that. But I think this is a good question related with quality of employment when you have to in Latin America, when you have to, or in other situations where you have to have two work to have a good level of well-being or related with the household income. I think that this is a good point, and this is one way to think about that. And the last question is about the you say the what is your second question?
Well, that you answered both of them, I think, and we are already over time. So thank you so much, Joaquin. So we can follow up the conversation one-to-one. So you're close by, so which is very good. So we should say thank you for everyone for participating. We look forward for the next II next week. So I wish everyone a great week. Thank you.